Yeah. Sure.
Well, my reminder's not here to tell me to turn the recording back on, so I didn't turn it off. It's fine. Usually when I'm not being totally lazy, before I upload the lecture, I'll actually cut out the breaks and things. But 100%. All right, let's come back. So start with the basics. What's the article about? What's the issue? What happens? Yeah. Yep, lots of people, right? What all got pardons? Okay. Okay. Sounds really specific. So 45,000 people had charges vacated if they were marijuana only. What year did Oregon legalize cannabis? Yep. So that was how long ago? Yeah, it's been a minute, right? What did you notice about the way that this particular thing, right, the governor pardoning all of these cases, what did you notice about the way that was talked about in terms of imagery, wording, that kind of thing? Who had the one with the governor going? Yeah, who had the one with the elderly white guy with the vaguely veteran-looking hat smoking a glass pipe while watching TV, right? Very different imagery, right? Yeah. What do you think about that? Did you find yourself sort of feeling swayed to be okay with the pardons or not okay with the pardons based on the way it was worded, depending on the news outlet? What kind of wording did you notice?
Well, from my art, it mostly like just addressed how like the convictions of having or less of marijuana is like crippling these people's lives, like housing, employment, and education.
So they really focused on the people that were actually charged, yeah, and how it affected them. Okay. Did any of the writers take a different sort of view or neglect to discuss that or talk about why or anything like that? Did any of them look at it in a negative type of portrayal or in a way that could be perceived as negative? Okay. What about wording? Look at some wording differences. Mhm.
Absolutely necessary.
There you go. That's a really strong way of wording it, right? Let's say you weren't from here. Let's say you had had some really negative experiences with marijuana and you saw pardons about 45,000 people for marijuana offenses, as opposed to marijuana possession convictions, as opposed to possession of small amounts of marijuana under the photo. Those all sounds, slightly different changes in wording, but can you see how that might sway people a little bit differently? Okay, so I want you to kind of think about those things when we talk about policy issues, but not just the particular policy issues we're going to talk about here, but in general, right? When you read the news, make sure you read same story across kind of all the different news outlets because they are all going to have slightly different twists, but also when you're looking at the way that research is used, right? Did any of these actually talk about research, talk about numbers? Yeah, how many people were pardoned, right? Did any of them look at, because this has been done, right? There has been, you saw this in New Jim Crow. We've looked at actual estimates of how many people have lost housing because of these types of convictions, those kinds of things, right? Did you see any of that in any of these news outlets? Okay, so any discussion of number of victims, however you're defining victim with marijuana, it's kind of difficult. Some people consider people purchasing to be victims, but that's kind of contentious. So those are all sort of numbers that you want to look for with any kind of policy issue, and also the wording, the kind of imagery that's used, all of that. So we are going to talk about mass incarceration as our example of policy. Your book brings up a couple different issues. They talk about drug use, they talk about sex trafficking, they talk about terrorism, they talk about immigration. Mass incarceration. No, it's not.
The UN. It's like UN.
Yeah, there we go. Look at that. So, no, get out of here. Stop. Let's look at incarceration by country. This is a really fun thing to look at if you want to be sad. Look at the United States and look at everywhere else. Down here, the highest. It's really not a great diagram because they could have used like green to red, like normal diagrams. But we could also go down here and look at the actual numbers. Now, this is going by number of people in prison. Obviously, that's going to be different based on population. However, China also has a really high population, like higher than ours. So that's not a good look. So then let's look at actual rates, right? So we have sort of absolute numbers. And then we have, I don't know why they think that there's something wrong with my algorithm because none of these things are things that I would purchase. Like, am I going to go rob a bank while wearing my headlight with like a snarky grandma sweater, wearing dad shoes? Cool. Whatever. Do I need to go to Columbia University? No, I have too many degrees and too much student debt. Fuck off. So, no, go away. Anyway, So World Population Review, huge statistics website if you need numbers for your paper. So what I like about World Population Review is they look at both absolute numbers and rates. You can find this for all kinds of things. You can find health data, you can find criminal justice data, you can find lots of data. We have a really high rate, and look at the countries that we are similar to. Where's Turkmenistan? Anybody know? Nope. No, it's not in Turkey. If any of you take global health at Portland State, one of the things that we do, I didn't teach it this year, but one of the things that we've done in the past is we give people a map of like South America and of Africa and of the Middle East and say, fill this out. Sorry. Because it's one of those things like, don't tell me about like health issues like AIDS in Africa if you don't know like what countries are in Africa. And like, don't tell me about, you know, drug trafficking and human trafficking in Southeast Asia if you don't even know where Thailand is. Like, get out of here. So that's a thing that we make people do so that they realize that they really should only be talking about issues that they actually know about. You know, I don't grade them on it because I'm not a total jerk. It's more of a be humbled experience, kind of like when I made you all take the citizenship test. Yeah. That's a thing. There was a link to it. Yeah, it's on Canvas. You should go take it. See. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we had to do it. My AP government final in like the 12th grade, everybody failed because it was a citizenship test. But that was when immigration was like a really hot topic. Just like, God, I'm gonna date myself back in the 2000s, you know? Yeah. Anyway, so we have really, really high numbers, and our numbers look a lot like, you know, Rwanda, where there's a genocide and apartheid. Okay. Turkmenistan, not sure what's going on there, but apparently something. El Salvador and Cuba, lots of issues going on there with drug trafficking and political crimes. Political crimes meaning issues around free speech, protesting, etc. So it doesn't really look good that as the United States, as a UN country, yeah, etc., that we have the highest rate of incarceration. So that's why it is a big issue. The other reason we're using mass incarceration as our main policy issue is that it's one of the only issues that looks at all the things. So it looks at race, it looks at gender, it looks at socioeconomics, all of those things. Boop, boop, boop. So even though the term refers to what is perceived as the disproportionately high rates, according to your book, we know that it actually is the highest rates based on all the numbers. Have we seen a decrease in crime? Mm-hmm. There are no stupid questions, only stupid answers. Just adults. Because that's a great question. See, they think it's a great question. Yeah, no, that is a good question. And that's because not everywhere incarcerates children. So that's a thing. But also, not every country reports data on juvenile incarcerations. So based on your reading, have we seen a decrease in crime as a result of mass incarceration? No. Have we seen any changes in recidivism based on mass incarceration? Not including people who are currently incarcerated and therefore can't recidivate. No. So, yeah. Under what theory would it lead to a decrease in crime? So think back to the beginning of the term. If I believe in X, I would believe that putting people in prison for all the things would decrease crime. That's one. Definitely. Somebody actually made that argument last year during the presentations. So if you have a topic that doesn't have a lot of research support and your assignment in your group is to argue in favor of that topic, you might just have to make things up. And somebody said, well, they can't recidivate if they're dead. But that is an argument that people actually make. So, you know, not a lot of data that supports it, and it is a colloquial argument. So that's a thing. But no. A model, a specific, somebody else said it, so say it louder. Yes, the crime control model. So according to the crime control model, if we incarcerate lots and lots of people, we would see a decrease in crime, and we have seen that that is not the case. In reality, we have really, really high recidivism in the United States because we now have decreased social engagement and increased marginalization. So people can be denied the right to vote, people can be excluded from juries, people can be discriminated against for employment and housing and all kinds of things, which leads people to commit more crime, which increases incarceration and so on and so forth, right? You read all of these things. Let's look and see what's happening here. Where do we see a big spike in imprisonment? A couple of big spikes. Yes. And also in the mid-late 70s. Yep. Between 1970 and whatever year that is. Thanks, Zoom. Can I move this? Can I put this somewhere else? That's not helpful. That's just the same thing. I don't, whatever. It's just, nothing works. Really? Why? Why is it like this? I don't understand. Oh, whoa. Oh, okay. So, who's in president? Who's in the presidency? Who's in the White House? Who's the president? Not who's in the president. That's inappropriate. No one is in the president. Oh no. You all read the book, right? Yeah, Nixon is the president. He's in the White House, starts the drug war. 80s comes along, Reagan continues the drug war. 90s comes along, we see a huge surge. Clinton's around, another huge surge. So all sort of tough on crime stuff. We see a major increase in incarceration. We see a slight increase in actual crime when it comes to burglary, motor vehicle theft, and homicide. What's missing? Yeah, drug crime. So even though we see all of these like really dangerous things increasing kind of, but also going down, notice that they all are decreasing here, even though incarceration, both federal and state, is increasing. That's a problem. There are times here where it's going down and incarceration continues to increase. So what we're seeing is that no matter what's happening with these types of crime, incarceration is continuing to increase from the 1970s all the way up through the 2000s. And then it starts to have a slight decrease up until 2008. And that's because the president at the time made a concerted effort to decrease mass incarceration. And then we don't have a lot of good data since then. We'll see what that looks like over the next few years when we finish up the clusterfuck that was the last 10 years and get data. You guys are laughing. Are you laughing at my use of the word clusterfuck, or are you laughing at, what are we laughing at? Just laughing in general. That's fine. It's just a laughy day. Why is it a laughy day? Are you guys high? Are you high in my class? Please don't come high to my class. I mean, you can, but like, don't drive home. Like, tell me and I'll get you an Uber or something. I don't need to die. Jeez. What's that? Yeah, don't do that either. One of my graduate students was high as shit a few weeks ago, and I was like, dude, you're not driving. Like, you need to figure your life out. Here we are. Yeah, don't do that. Don't come high to the criminal justice class. Like I'm a social worker. I know when people are on drugs. Okay. Here's some more recent data between 2006 and 2016. Note that the numbers are going down. And this is a preliminary report. This is from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which is not the same as the Department of Justice. So preliminary data, we'll see what happens. Total number has gone down. Parole is about the same. Prison's gone down a tiny little bit. Probation's gone down. Note that the reason the total has gone down, look at the discrepancy between the number of people on probation compared to the number of people that are on parole or in prison. And so that total includes all of the technically below, not above. So we'll see what happens. Looking at politics, this is where things get interesting. Trump, tough on crime, -5% in federal inmates. This is just federal, this isn't state or county. So we know that people can have all kinds of rhetoric and their behavior might not match the rhetoric, and the rhetoric might have different outcomes that are unintended. So maybe we'll see differences in state numbers from that era. And again, our big drug war presidents, Bush, Clinton, Bush 1, Reagan, Nixon, big increases there. Carter, what's up with Jimmy Carter? Anybody know? Carter's a cool dude. Everybody loves Carter. Everybody from all sides loves Carter. Anyway, big decrease, mostly due to funding issues. And this doesn't show it, but if you look at the state data, there was an increase, the state incarcerations continue to increase. So essentially more state issues with mass incarceration and a decrease in federal inmates. This is percentage. Also doesn't include private prisons. So everybody read Angela Davis. Okay, good. So let's talk about policy issues and what, this is a social work class, so we're going to talk about sociological things like class, gender, and race. What did Davis have to say about socioeconomic class and mass incarceration? What's that? It sure does, has a lot to do with it. Definitely. Let's look at some quotes here. This is about gender and class. And the idea of deviance, right? So like we did at the beginning of the term, read the quote, deconstruct the quote, tell me what it says in your own words. Has anyone read The Yellow Wallpaper, Charlotte Perkins Gilman? It's a classic. I was doing a book club at the state hospital in the forensic unit with the ladies. I had them read it because I'm a bad person. If you read it, you'll understand the joke. They found it really relatable. It's fine. It's nothing important. Yeah, no, answer the question. 7:30, let's go.
So it's basically saying that women were more going to mental institutions than men were going to criminal institutions, so they're really more
Yeah, so we see this kind of rhetoric used when we talk about criminals. What do you typically picture? Yeah, we tend to picture men, and even the way that we have different types of narratives around specific types of crime, for example, infanticide. When women kill their children, we often perceive them as a culture as having some kind of mental health issue, right? It's because of postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. And often that's true. However, when we see men commit the same type of crime, we don't look at mental health as much. We look at, we perceive it as criminality as opposed to a mental health issue. Still an issue, still a major issue. We do see huge proportions of mental health issues, both in male and female prisons, but we have higher proportions of females in mental health institutions. So both are true. And we tend to criminalize men at higher rates than we do women in our culture. What about the idea of undesirables in general when it comes to class? This is the long one, but what else? So we saw crime statistics falling, but we saw prison construction and incarceration increasing in one of those graphs, right? Which didn't come from this book, totally separate data source. What is the connection between the economy becoming deinstitutionalized and poor people becoming incarcerated? This is kind of abstract, right? Sociology stuff. So during this era, we see lots of deregulation in major industries, things like steel, coal mining, garment factories, agriculture, so on and so forth. We see a decrease in labor union power, and we see an increase in incarceration and inmates used for labor for industries that had previously been doing poorly. Right? So who does your laundry in the state of Oregon if you go to the hospital? Who builds your dorm furniture? We've talked about that before. So lots of big industries. Farm labor is huge. We don't see that here as much in Oregon. We use underpaid migrant slaves for that instead. That's a thing. OPB had a whole thing about it, particularly in the cannabis industry. But back east, and particularly in the South, you can still rent out inmates to do farm work. It is effectively agricultural slavery. And so there is a class piece there. This tends to be people who are poor and who turn to things like drug sales because they don't have other options, because maybe their industry has fallen to pieces because of deregulation and so on and so forth. Maybe they have a substandard wage, and so they end up selling drugs. Maybe they are dealing with, so in the area where I grew up, the Ohio Valley, it is one of the worst areas hit by the opioid crisis, and that is thought to be because of unemployment and mental health issues related to closure of steel mills and coal mines. People there take a lot of pride in their work. NPR did a big special on it, and they were interviewing people about what it meant to be a coal miner, what it meant to work in a steel mine, and people talked about, well, yeah, I got emphysema, but that was normal, and I earned my emphysema, and that was like a thing that people say when they're 50 years old and they're dying from black lung. And now they're all dying from fentanyl and heroin overdoses instead. So we see this link here between socioeconomic class, people who are marginalized economically, and mass incarceration because of increased drug use, increased drug sales, so on and so forth. Does that make sense? She also talks quite a bit about how this falls into what would you consider to be what Marx would call late capitalism, what Davis calls contemporary capitalism. Does everyone know what that's referring to? Folks have read Marx in your basic kind of undergrad and sociology classes, yeah? Kind of. What's that? That's fair. If you haven't read Marx, you should read Marx, because lots of people go, oh, Marxism, oh, socialism, but maybe two of them have ever actually read Das Kapital, so like you should do that. It's not a hard read, lots of new translations. Essentially, late capitalism is the phase of capitalism which we are sort of aiming toward right now, where early capitalism is the idea that anyone with capital can start a business and be successful at that business. Late capitalism is where we see this huge divide between the people who have capital, the people who don't, where it takes so much capital to start, say, to become an entrepreneur and do like a tech startup or any kind of company where a person could increase their capital such that it would make enough difference to justify using that amount of capital in the first place. For example, if you're going into real estate and somebody gives you $1 million loan to purchase your big high rise in New York City, and then you become a big real estate mogul and it's exponential, as opposed to somebody who becomes a real estate agent and they sell a few houses, then the market turns, and then they sell nothing, and then they're broke. Big difference, right? So exponential growth versus minimal growth. People who make a living versus the 1% to 3%. That is what Marx was talking about with late capitalism. So the idea is that with early capitalism, you could come to a country like America and start a business and be successful and make a living. Whereas now we have monopolies, right? So there are like 6 companies that own every single grocery item at the store, even though they all have different brands, that kind of thing. So Angela is talking about mass incarceration in the context of late capitalism and what that looks like and why folks on the lower end of the economic spectrum are ending up incarcerated. She also talks about it here in terms of quantifying incarceration. So again, labor time has a value. We see types of punishments that include labor rising with the rise of industrialization. Does that make sense? So for a really, really long time, up until the industrial period, labor wasn't necessarily, you didn't get paid per hour. You might get paid per product. You know, let's say you work in a garment factory, you get paid for before shift work existed, basically. Shift work came along with industrialization and unionization. Prior to that, it was you have to finish 100 of this item. It might take you all day, it might take you 6 hours, whatever. That's what you do before you get paid. Or if you worked on a shipyard, you go to the end of the day, you collect your pay for the day. You're not getting some sort of hourly wage with a paycheck. That came with industrialization. So pretty recent development in our history, only about 150 years or so. And that's the same time we start to see labor used as punishment and the idea of computing punishment in terms of time, as opposed to what we talked about 2 weeks ago, which was punishment until we feel like we're better. So prior to industrialization, we might say, well, we're going to stick you. She talks a lot about early prisons and how they stick you in a cell with a Bible and some writing stuff and whatever. And basically you stay here until we think that you're better. Not great because it's subjective, but she's pointing out here that we see this idea of time being a measurable component, right? Punishment being in a number of months or a number of years, correlating with time being a payable component. So she's again kind of connecting this idea of labor and punishment being connected in terms of time being some kind of objective way to measure both, and both have a numerical value and therefore a monetary value. Let's talk about some more gender stuff. We know that the huge majority of women that are incarcerated have experienced domestic violence. We don't know what the data looks like that for men because it hasn't been studied, but we do know that the huge majority of men that are incarcerated have post-traumatic stress disorder, meet DSM-5 criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder from some kind of issue in their life, whether it's domestic violence or just violence in the communities. We don't know. It hasn't been studied extensively. But then we see this type of violence continue in the prison, right? Particularly in women's prison. There was a nurse, Department of Corrections in Oregon a couple years ago. I say a couple years ago, but I don't know because the last 3 years are a weird time warp, who didn't get convicted, but had a civil suit from several dozen female AICs for sexual misconduct. It's very interesting that it wasn't a criminal case and turned into a civil case. So that tells you a little bit about the culture and a little bit about what happens and how many people it took to come forward before they could actually build a case against this person, and why didn't it go to criminal court, right? These are very real issues. So we see here she's kind of talking about prison as perpetuating pre-existing violence in the community. For women, it tends to be sexual and domestic. For men, it's just the overall feeling of violence within the institution. Overall, this is really cheerful. You guys look super happy. Basically, the prison becomes a place where we deposit people we consider to be undesirable, whether that is the mentally ill, the criminal, people that are poor, so on and so forth. And it makes us feel better, right? We can stick people in prison. We don't have to look at them anymore. That means we no longer feel like we have to engage with those issues, particularly issues produced by things like late-stage capitalism, racism, gender inequality, classism, so on and so forth. If we don't have to see the problem anymore, it's no longer a problem. What happens when we move all the homeless people from the street and stick them into designated camp areas? Do people care about homelessness as much? Do people talk about homelessness as much? What happens when all those people end up in the jail or at the state hospital and we no longer see them? We no longer have to actually engage with those issues, right? So when we see that happening on a mass scale, what do you think that does to us as a society? What's that? Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for people who don't, I mean, prisons function the way that they function because we don't see them, right? When was the last time any of you walked past the jail and knew that you were walking past the jail? Probably not, because it's the Multnomah County Justice Center and it looks really pretty on the outside. But you're probably not going to drive past IJ, Inverness Jail, because it's way out in the boonies. If you drive around downtown Salem, you're going to pass the Oregon State Penitentiary, but it's like way back. There's like a really nice brick wall and some really pretty cottages and all the old warden buildings. And then there's the wall, right? But it's like a few hundred yards. At the state hospital, we have a real nice, yard. There's a disc golf course. You can go play disc golf at the state hospital. People do it. It's weird, whatever. It's a thing. And then there's the wall, but it's a really nice looking wall. It's red brick, it matches the original building, so on and so forth. You don't actually see the people, right? You see people if you drive down the highway, and you might see the minimum folks and they're out there picking up litter. But for the most part, we don't actually see the millions of people who are incarcerated. So they're out of sight, out of mind. And so it prevents us from actually engaging with some of those problems. So about New Jim Crow. So Alexander talks about race a bit, well, quite a bit. Alexander really focuses on race, but she looks a lot at intersectionality with class and gender. So she's focusing really on the drug wars, mass incarceration, particularly of low-income Black men. Why do you think that is? Why is that a good demographic to study mass incarceration? What's that? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we see when we look at the actual numbers, we see that this is the group that faces mass incarceration more often than other groups. And there's intersection, right? Has everyone heard the term intersectionality before? Kind of. Yeah.
So everyone knows, like,
Oh, at least on my own. I think this exists. Maybe Band-Aid. Excellent. I swear I have some. Let me look, because I got the big fat ones, you know?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you. Okay, whatever. Don't kill my markers. No, we talked about racism. Like, first of all, what is the difference racism from do you know the difference? Yeah. So basically individual versus kind of structural whole group stuff. So let's say, let me give an example. Let's talk about like intergenerational wealth. Let's use whites or brown. For white people, let's say this is the intergenerational wealth. And let's say we use blacks or B. So if we want to look at the intersection of classism between classes and race, for instance, let's say I'm a white person down here, and I'm like, well, racism isn't real because I'm poor and I'm white. But we're not taking into account the whole group thing. Or we look at like a Black person up here and we say, see, Oprah's rich, that means racism doesn't exist. Or see, Obama's the president, that means racism doesn't exist. But we don't take into account the whole picture, right? So prejudice would be individualized. Prejudice is you look at somebody and you have some sort of bias and you behave based on that bias. Anything that has an ism is talking about that whole picture stuff. Individual acts can occur as a result of an ism, right? We can engage in prejudice based on racism, or somebody might have prejudice that goes against whatever the ism. So reverse racism doesn't exist, but somebody might be prejudiced against white people, and that's an individual thing, as opposed to say a structural issue. Does that make sense? So when we talk about intersectionality, we are talking about there are different types of marginalization and different types of privilege. So this could be lots of different things. Let's say there's race. Let's say there's gender. Let's say there's class. Let's have disability. There's lots of other identities where people talk about things like Christian privilege. But basically, intersectionality is how these different issues intersect with each other. For example, a white female, you know, that, statistically affirmative action has been more helpful to people who look like me than it has for people of color, even though the original intent was for people of color. We have the white women are the people who have benefited most from affirmative action. Because as women, we still face marginalization due to gender, but due to race privilege, that's less of an issue. Race privilege means things like access to education, access to extracurricular activities, all those kinds of things that make people accomplish more level. So we see the way that gender and race intersect better. We also see the way that gender and race intersect when it comes to the nature of process. So she's talking about specifically Black men and how Black men don't get the same types of privileges that other men do when it comes to sex. Does that make sense? So what are some examples from the book about those intersections? What are some things that she says?
I mean, I can just show you. So she uses the word caste. I really like a lot of the language that Alexander uses because she creates a very, very vivid picture and she uses terminology in very specific ways. So she uses the word caste to refer to specific groups as opposed to just saying low socioeconomic and Black and this and that, right? She uses, she essentially conceptualizes our society as a caste system. What is she talking about here? Remember earlier in the term where we talked about theories of criminology? What theory of criminology would fit this idea that people choose to commit crimes and therefore become voluntarily part of this sort of lower caste? Anybody remember? Mm-hmm. Yep. So we have this idea that people make choices and they choose to commit crimes, and that's why they end up getting locked up. And she talks about the politics of responsibility, right? Everyone's heard the term personal responsibility thrown around probably quite a bit. And obviously that's true in some cases, but what she's really looking at is how different types of people violate the law and how different types of law violations are treated differently. So statistically, if you are speeding, you are putting others at risk at a higher rate than smoking marijuana, right? We know this. You're more likely to kill someone if you speed on the highway. And yet, how many of you have sped on the highway? Okay. How many of you have gone to prison for speeding on the highway? Do you think you should go to prison for speeding on the highway? Probably not, right? Because speeding in of itself isn't hurting anyone, but it has the potential to hurt people. That's kind of the same argument we see with drug use, right? Well, okay, this person's using and that has the potential to harm other people, therefore that's a crime and we should incarcerate them, right? It makes people uncomfortable because that's the narrative that our culture tends to push. And so of course it's uncomfortable to think about, but when you think about really teasing apart these different types of behaviors and what the actual consequences are and the way that we criminalize them, that's what we really want to look at here when it comes to making policy decisions. Here's a fun statistic. What do y'all think about this? What sort of image is she drawing up here? And is that an image that you feel is kind of fits the narrative? Has anyone heard the phrase culture of poverty before? Yeah, what does that mean? Or what context have you heard it used in? Have you ever heard somebody like post on Facebook or complain about how they saw somebody like using their EBT card, but they had their nails done or they had an iPhone, right? So that's like a very specific type of imagery. And it creates this idea, this person is lazy, right? This person can afford to get their nails done, they can afford to have a phone, but they have to use food stamps. So those are the sorts of narratives, the sorts of stories that probably maybe happen, but not as often as people say, but it creates an image. And these are the kinds of images that perpetuate those stereotypes that call to mind these larger social issues. So the reason that this particular issue comes up is that during, particularly during the Reagan era, this idea of a culture of poverty was pushed. And the idea was that, well, this particular type of family ends up engaged in crime because that's just their culture. Or if we were to put that differently, remember the theory of criminology that says that people act a certain way because of the neighborhood that they're in or the type of people they're around? What were those theories? Anybody remember? You have them in your notes, so bring your notes to your exam, right? But you can see the ways that those theories then influence actual policy, right? If we believe that people commit crime because it's just part of their culture and we have these stereotypes about different cultures, we're going to then end up criminalizing and thus incarcerating those people, and then we're going to end up with a real issue. So in this particular example, she's talking about a particular demographic of Black men not having access to families, and that's fulfilling the stereotype of absent fathers, right? And that's why people commit crime, because their dads aren't around, but their dads aren't around because they're being incarcerated. And so it becomes this sort of self-fulfilling, very stereotypical cultural idea. We are going to listen to an interview with Dr. Alexander. This is from 2020, so it has some things that are a little outdated because that was an election year. What time is it? Okay, good. Let's see if the sound works. It's gonna like blast out, isn't it? Oh, yep, sure is.
But the political rights ranking on top of and the influential media company never heard of.
When the new Jim Crow came out a decade ago, you said it would go to the person I was 10 years ago. Take me back to those days.
Twenty years ago from today. And during those years, I was working in this. And I was well aware that there was science. That's why I was clear. But what I didn't understand is the operational. Is heading to work first day and be doing it. Remember, I was thinking to myself, doesn't help to make comparisons in Jim Crow. People just think you're crazy, and then I help the best job. It was really as a result of presenting.
What was the awakening like? What were you seeing in the Christmas?
Beginning to collect data. In middle class, either suburban communities. This wasn't talked to me in any way, but this scale of it was astonishing. You know, seeing pose documented find out because talk that are extremely minor or favorite. But there was one incident in particular that they did on change the way I think. He walked in my office carrying a stack of papers a couple of inches thick. He could take it detailed notes of the counter of the piece. And at the time, I was interviewing wow, we could find it. Maybe plainest, maybe this is the one we've been looking for. And then he says something. And you just stay there. We knew we could put someone on the stand if they had a felony record because we can subject them to cross-examination about prior criminal history and trying to trial and his conduct. So I'm looking at it and I'm saying, I think you're a drug felon. He gets very quiet. Let me tell you what happened. It's a long story about it. More and more comes of age and wants to become explaining that he was making a plea with the time and they told him that he just took the plea to walk right out with just felony probation. But what's it become of these? I can't get a job anywhere. Like you have to sleep in my grandma's basement at night because I can't even get into public housing with a drug felony. How am I supposed to take care of myself? Am I supposed to take care of myself as a man? Like I can't even feed myself. Like I can't even get food stamps because of my drug felony. Because good luck finding one young black man in my neighborhood.
How conscious was that? How would you argue that it was a conscious decision to establish successor in a sense to Jim Crow?
We were mixed motives. And one of the things history of the Southern strategy, the deliberate liberal strategy using get tough racial appeals taking the South, fearful of and resentful of the Southern strategy was in part about turning the clock back on racial progress. So the drug war was in part politically motivated strategy backlash to the civil rights movement, but it was also a reflection of conscious and unconscious biases fueled by media portrayals of drug users, those racial stereotypes, or president stereotypes, race, strange and
Taking issue with your focus on drugs and unfunded drugs, found in his book, Locked In, said that only about 16% of state prisoners, very few of them, about 5 to 6% of that group are both another.
it is true that roughly half of people the system of mass incarceration is not simply about who is behind bars at the moment. It is this much larger system, a system that begins on a young person swept off the street for a minor drug offense like possession of branded there are twice as many people on probation or parole today than are prisoners for jails. Twice as many. And that is the new Jim Crow.
Well, we'll front other candidates, the Democratic nomination, with some more. Does anybody seem particularly advanced in their life?
Well, I would have to say that, you know, I have found this family brings such, you know, criminal justice.
All right, so she does a pretty good job of summing up the book there. At one point, I was noticing that the official transcript doesn't follow the actual interview, which is really annoying. But if folks want to read it, she points out a lot of nuances in the transcript and in the book, which you all read. But she does go into kind of summarizing some of those nuances. What do you remember reading about solutions from both Davis and from Alexander, ways that we could fix this kind of big problem that we've created? Let's start with Davis, because hers was shorter and a little simpler. Anybody remember? Has anybody watched the documentary 13th? Yeah, so both Davis and Alexander interviewed in that. That's a little more recent. But they talk about some solutions there as well. So Davis's, I mean, the title of her book itself, right, or Prisons Obsolete, she essentially argues for getting rid of the current punishment model of incarceration completely by fixing these sort of underlying problems. And she argues for rehabilitation. So she talks about that within historical context, right? So she starts the book off by talking about what prisons looked like 100 years ago, what the first prisons in the United States looked like, what their purpose was, what they were used for, so on and so forth. And then she compares that to what prisons look like now. And she essentially tries to argue for a return, not to the exact same thing, right? Not putting people in a stone wall with bread and water and a Bible, but essentially to a return to this idea of reformation, of helping people kind of rejoin society and become productive members of society, whatever that looks like. What about Alexander? What are some of her arguments for solutions? And think about it in terms, okay, well, here's, you know, when we talk about solutions, you want to look at like, okay, what does she say the causes are? So based on what she says the issues are around things like race, gender, socioeconomic class. All right. Does anyone have any of your ideas for solutions for this problem in terms of policy, right? So that's what we're talking about. If you were a legislator, what kind of policies would you enact to decrease or end mass incarceration in your jurisdiction? Okay. Yeah, so like anti-bias training, that kind of thing. Absolutely. And we see that happening in a lot of places. What else? So Alexander in particular talks about sort of how people end up in this system, right? She talks about childhood, she talks about family structure, she talks about class structure. What are some of those other big picture things that seem unrelated that you would work on? Yeah, so just kind of increasing overall access to education, absolutely. When you think about the Ohio Valley and the opioid crisis, what are those issues? That's a sort of a classism issue. Thoughts? Do you think if those people all had jobs again and they could support their families, they would still have the same issues? Maybe, probably not. Yeah. So job access to housing is a big one, particularly right now. We don't see that talked about as much in New Jim Crow because it was less of an issue at the time that it was written. But right now, at least in Oregon, that's a huge issue. So if we pardon these offenses, right, for 45,000 people, what happens? What's that?
They can become households.
Well, if we pardon their offenses, then they kind of lose that barrier, right? And keep in mind, there's also a difference between pardoning and actually vacating somebody's record. We don't know what's going to happen with that yet, but if you are, you know, like, so if you, in certain states, if you have a felony, you can't vote. In some places, you can't access public housing, you can't access a job, so you end up needing public housing, so on and so forth. And so making policies around that, but that's still, you know, take all stakeholders into account. Because if I'm an employer and you tell me you have to hire felons now, right, I'm probably not going to like that. So as a policymaker, you have to come up with some kind of policy that helps all the stakeholders. And there are programs that do that. So supportive employment programs. If you guys heard of Dave's Killer Bread, that's an entire business model that is based around the idea of hiring formerly incarcerated individuals, and it works. It's popular. It's a great product. They make money, you know. So you have to kind of be creative, right? You can't just make a blanket policy that says you have to house people that have felonies. You can, but it might not be popular. You're going to get a lot of pushback from property owners and like housing associations and that kind of thing. So instead, and that's why we see certain types of housing projects go up in certain types of neighborhood and kind of just perpetuates that cycle. So you have to come up with some kind of creative policy that's going to make everyone happy. What do you think that could look like in terms of housing? Is anyone here from Lake Oswego? They're really adamant, like, no. They just broke ground on their first affordable housing project ever. Which is like sad, but also kind of funny because they're like really proud of it. Of the fact that that's even happening. Like the mayor's like posting on like all over Instagram. And you're like, oh, guys. And he captioned it with like, because every child deserves a Lake O childhood. And you're like, oh, yikes. Whatever that means. Anyway, in 2022, first affordable housing project. Good job, guys. But that's the kind of thing that we do need, though, on a serious note, is building affordable housing in neighborhoods that have good education systems and neighborhoods that have access to, I mean, even just things that aren't in food deserts, right? I went to a site visit today for one of my graduate students at a mental health crisis center, and I had to drive up to Vancouver through like an industrial parkway that's all like cranes and factories and train yards, and then there's the crisis center. And like the first thing I asked, I'm like, so if somebody's having a mental health crisis, how do they get here? Is there a bus? Is there a train? And they're like, nope. Well, what do you do? Well, we call them an Uber. I'm like, okay. So like that works for them because it's a small facility. It only has 18 beds. But if we're talking about in general, that's probably not great, right? For larger facilities, that would be a problem. So things like transportation, things like housing, all of those things that seem unrelated to things like incarceration, those are things we have to think about. What happened when the Emmanuel Hospital was built? Anybody know the history of that neighborhood? So a largely Black and low-income neighborhood in Portland, one of the only Black neighborhoods in Portland because redlining wasn't made illegal until the 90s. That's a whole other thing we could talk about for a long time. Essentially, several neighborhood associations tried to stop the project, but nobody listened to them because it was mostly older folks, Black folks and low-income folks, and they plowed down the entire neighborhood, built a new corridor for I-5, all for the stated purpose of building the Emmanuel Hospital. But really, it was to expand the I-5 corridor through that area. And then those people had nowhere to go, got pushed out into sort of deep, deep Northeast Portland, where there were no services, very few grocery stores, not great public transit, all that kind of stuff. And so you can see those things that seem totally unrelated to incarceration leading to increased issues within neighborhoods that would lead to issues with incarceration. So we're talking about sort of systemic issues, right? Class, race, gender. In that case, age was a big one because these were mostly older folks that lived in generational homes that got mowed down to build that corridor. All that kind of thing. So yeah, happy, cheerful stuff. So we're talking about policy. We're supposed to end on a cheerful note, right? Tell me solutions. Tell me your ideas, future criminal justice professionals. Sweep before finals. You don't care. Cool. All right, well, if you haven't read the last few chapters of both of those books, you should, because they both have lots of great policy suggestions that are based on research. They also have lots of research that you can use in your papers and kind of go down the researchy rabbit hole for your papers and your projects. Yeah. What's that? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Access to healthcare is huge. Huge, huge, huge. Most of the people that end up, actually, fun fact, the largest healthcare provider in the state of Oregon is the Department of Corrections with 14,000 patients. So yeah, access to healthcare is big, particularly mental health care. I had one client, a very concrete example of that. I had a client at the prison who was there for a series of armed robberies because his wife needed a mastectomy and he couldn't pay for it. So yeah, that's a thing that happens. Yeah. Next week. Yeah. If it's going to be late, there are details on your syllabus on the percentage penalty for lateness. I will, that's because ideally you would present on the same stuff as your paper, right? So I'm trying to make it easy. Trying to make it easy. As you're writing your paper, you'll come up with things to put in your presentation.
So is our presentation supposed to be like you're presenting like the topic in general, or is it supposed to be more argumentative?
Want to see kind of all sides, you know, but also like tell me the research. It's really about the research. I want to see if you can take research and talk about it in a way that's not boring and makes sense. Here's what it means. Hello. Let me turn this off.